This is the 2750T Unit 7 review. And like always, I'm going to just go through this list of questions, discuss the answers, and I'm going to try to keep it kind of short. That way I'll use less of your time. So we have two topics in this unit. We have nationalism and we have imperialism. And they're pretty closely related as well. And so we'll start with this nationalism. And the first question: what hindered Italian efforts toward unification between 1815 and 1848? And the big short answer is the Concert of Europe, the Congress system. How did the Concert of Europe hinder Italian efforts at unification? Well, like we said, the Concert of Europe's mission was to suppress nationalism in favor of conservatism. It was a very conservative Congress, and it established a very conservative order. They suppressed nationalism by military force if necessary. And in fact, two parts of Italy, Venetia and Lombardy, were part of the Austrian Empire. So this next one is: what groups were attempting to destroy the conservative status quo that the Concert of Europe, i.e. the Congress system, or the Congress of Vienna, had established in 1815? You had some big groups. You had nationalists, you had liberals, Republicans of all kinds, including utopian socialists, regular socialists, and communists. And so what are some examples of efforts of liberal revolutionaries? And we have quite a long list that we can think of. Some things such as the Greek War of Independence and the Decembrist Revolt in Russia in 1825, which was a protest against Nicholas I assuming the throne, the Russian throne. Nicholas I, of course, was an arch-conservative, reactionary autocrat. You also had the Polish Rebellion, 1830 to 1831, and this was an uprising of Polish nationalists that the Russians brutally crushed. You had the July Revolution in France in 1830, in which the upper middle class of France got rid of an inherited authoritarian and replaced him with a monarch that was on the side of the middle classes and who was willing to honor the French Charter. You had the French Revolution of 1848, which got rid of Louis Philippe and replaced him, at least temporarily, with Louis Napoleon and a Republican government. So there is just some examples of some liberal efforts to undermine the Concert of Europe and the Congress of Vienna. How did the breakdown of the Concert of Europe open the way for both Germany and Italy to become nations? The reason the breakdown helped was because after the Concert of Europe started to crack and disintegrate, there was no overarching conservative force to hinder that process of unifying by Germany and by Italy. They had to fight for it. For example, Piedmont Sardinia had to get into a war with Austria in order to unify Italy. How did the Crimean War contribute to the breakdown of the Concert of Europe? The Crimean War revealed the weakening of the Ottoman Empire, and France, England, and Piedmont Sardinia all fought against another member of the Concert of Europe, Russia, because they were concerned about a breakdown of the balance of power. They wanted to prop up the Ottoman Empire, which was weakening. What ideology contributed most to the breakdown of the Concert of Europe? And I would say that ideology was nationalism. Nationalism is the answer to a lot of these questions. The whole theme is nationalism. What agenda did Cavour and Bismarck co-opt for their own uses in creating a unified nation? Once again, that's nationalism. How is appealing to the ideology of nationalism, let's bring this up a bit, how is that consistent with the strategy of realpolitik? A person who pursues realpolitik will use whatever means necessary to achieve his practical goals without regard to any kind of specific ideology. And that leads to the question, what is realpolitik? And realpolitik is related to some things that we've seen before. Politik, you can hear how they're similar words, and that's no accident. Not to mention reason of state. And now you've got this realpolitik. It's anti-ideological, and in realpolitik, you consider what is practical and what is expedient rather than what is moral or what is ideological. And you leave your ideology at the door in negotiating and in your thinking process. So, what does it mean to co opt something? Uh, to co opt something means to adopt an idea or a policy for one's own use, particularly if that use is a role other than its original or intended purpose. How did both Bismarck and Cavour both use realpolitik to unify their nations? That's the next question. Well, they combined it with nationalism. They combined realpolitik with nationalism. So, how did Cavour, Bismarck, and Napoleon III use nationalism to achieve state building? Napoleon III, an autocrat, co opted French nationalism to strengthen his control over France. And he proved that authoritarianism and nationalism could actually work well together. What made Bismarck, Cavour, and Napoleon III different from previous conservative politicians? Again, realpolitik and harnessing the power of nationalism to their own ends. Before these three, autocrats tended to have a hate kind of relationship with nationalism. They did not trust it at all. And whom did Cavour ally with in a war to take Italian territories from Austria for the purposes of Italian unification? And that was Emperor Napoleon III, formerly Louis Napoleon of France, who became the leader of France in 1848 as the first French president and who became emperor just 4 years later. So, what might you call Cavour's strategy for unifying Italy? Again, this theme comes up over and over. Realpolitik, sacrificing Savoy and Nice to save an alliance that he needed. Also sending Garibaldi to Sicily to exploit a revolt against the Bourbon king of the two Sicilies. And that worked out really well for him in both cases. So what are a couple of examples of Cavour's realpolitik? Right there. An alliance with Napoleon III and sending Garibaldi to Sicily. So what are some ways in which nationalists encouraged loyalty to the nation? And then it says, what are some examples of nationalists who encourage loyalty to the nation? I'm not sure that those are that different. But let's talk about that first one, some ways in which nationalists encourage loyalty to the nation. You've got centralized institutions like military service and compulsory education. You've got a common currency. Those are ways that nationalists encourage loyalty to the nation. Standard weights and measures that everybody uses, everybody understands. A postal service, images of leaders and events on stamps and on banknotes, on statues, improved railroads and highways, the growth of literacy, more books on history, patriotic anecdotes, capital cities, flags, military uniforms, national anthems, pledges, mascots, new holidays, and memorials. And some examples of nationalists who encourage loyalty to the nation, this won't surprise you, Cavour, Bismarck, Napoleon III. So what was growing nationalism a response to? Well, nationalism was a response to things like the Industrial Revolution, political revolutions, authoritarian rule, foreign domination, ethnic inequality, and class hierarchy. And that leads us to imperialism. Wow, we're halfway there, halfway through this review. So let's start with China and India. Why did China and India actually go backwards in terms of per capita production? Let me bring that up a bit. European powers, looking for raw materials and bigger markets, colonized and dominated these countries and these areas politically and economically, and deliberately hindered the development of industries that could compete with their own industries, largely by forcing trade agreements upon these countries that advantaged them while disadvantaging the Asian or African country. And so what are some examples of this process? How about China? the Opium Wars, the Boxer Rebellion, India, the Sepoy Rebellion. And so, what two things did the industrialized nations of the second half of the 19th century, now we're talking about the new imperialism, what were two things that they needed from the rest of the world in order to sustain their mass production economy? Three S's. Yeah, I can't let that go. Two things that they needed were, and these are big and very closely related to each other, raw materials and markets for their products. Raw materials to keep feeding the factories, and markets to keep selling what the factories produced. It's all about the factories. It's all about keeping people in those factories employed and working and earning and paying their taxes, etc. So, what were the other considerations that motivated European nations to colonize Asia and Africa? Because it wasn't just raw materials and markets. There was certainly more to it than that. For example, strategic considerations. Perfect example of that is conquering Sudan just to protect more important Egypt from the south. It's really about conquering the Sudan. It was really about protecting Egypt. And monitoring Egypt was really just about protecting the Suez Canal. And so it's really just about economics and trade and using the Suez Canal to extend your colonial empire. Another thing is feelings of racial and cultural superiority, competition with other European powers, and of course, national pride. So, what were three main things that made imperialism so much easier for Europeans in the second half of the 19th century than it had ever been before? And as we know, it was just about impossible to penetrate Asia or Africa previously. Like in the days of exploration and conquest, they couldn't do it. They didn't have the kind of technology that they had in the second half of the 19th century. And that included things like, number one, advanced weapons technology. And number two, advanced communication and transportation technology. And number three, advances in medicines like quinine, which protected Europeans from such illnesses as malaria. Some examples of advanced weapons technology that was available to Europeans to use against indigenous people, things like repeating rifles and machine guns. These things are, by the way, mass produced, made in great numbers in the factory system. And of course, you had steam powered gunboats that could go just about anywhere where there was water. Be sure to look at the image stimuli carefully in this test. If you have an image and all the answer choices look good, then you need to ask yourself which one of these good answer choices is most reflected in the image. And so that's just a little tip right there. So, how did imperialism create tensions between European countries that strained alliance systems? And keep in mind, when you're talking about the four main underlying causes of World War I, one of those is imperialism, and one of those is alliance systems. Let me just make two quick spelling corrections. I must have done this fast. You had several things going on: competition for territory, markets, competition for raw materials, and using some of these colonies as strategic way stations for your ships, for your navy, coaling stations and repair stations, etc. And that made even lousy places and unprofitable places worth having. So, what are some examples of diplomatic attempts to forestall the negative consequences of imperialism among European countries? Because, this competition could lead to some serious warfare that could trace itself, go all the way back to Europe. So some examples would be like the Berlin Conference of 1884 to sort out the various claims that various Europeans had on Africa and basically prevent any kind of a war that could happen as a result of not settling all of these claims. How about the French withdrawal from the Fashoda crisis? They withdrew, but they withdrew in humiliation and embarrassment. In fact, the president of France said, hey, they have soldiers, we only have arguments. How about resolving both Moroccan crises, 1905 and 1911? And by the way, our lessons will go into much more detail about those, and you've already seen that. How about the Entente Cordiale between France and Britain? All of these are ways of forestalling the various competitions among European powers for these colonies. How did encounters between imperialists and non-European indigenous peoples provoke artists to address moral questions of colonies? And we had a couple of those. One of the things I might mention is Gauguin, Picasso. They imitated indigenous styles and they incorporated some of those ideas into their very influential work. Not to mention somebody specified by name in our textbook, and that would be Joseph Conrad and his books such as Heart of Darkness. Not to mention, you wouldn't call him a non-European, but Lenin's anti-imperialism and the way he incorporated imperialism into his thoughts on capitalism. He thought that imperialism indicated that capitalism was really on its last legs. And then what was the response to imperialism in colonies around the world? And the big one there is it's something that they learned, these colonies around the world learned from Europeans, was nationalism of their own. For example, the Hindu National Congress in India. Another way that these Asian or African places responded to imperialism was attempts at rapid modernization of themselves. For example, the prime example would be in Japan with the Meiji Restoration. They actually modernized quickly enough to become a world power and actually take on legit European powers beginning in the 20th century. So that's the review. I hope that helps, and I hope you do well on the test. And good luck. We'll see you then. Thank you very much.